Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening to everyone that's joined. And welcome to this virtual event hosted by FT Strategies, the Night Lab at Northwestern Medill, and supported by the Google News Initiative. Today, we're here to talk about our recently released Next Gen News 2 study. And we'll dive deeper into how news media can better anticipate the way audiences will consume news in 2030, and of course, the strategies to meet them. I am joined today by three fantastic people. I am Lamberto Lambertini, Insights Manager at FT Strategies, and alongside me is Jeremy, who is a co-author of the Next Gen News Report and the Digital Media Strategy Chair at Night Lab Northwestern Medill. We are also joined by two emerging exemplary news producers that feature prominently in our study. We have Oluwadunsin. She is the head of editorial and innovation at Bella Naija. Bella Naija is a Nigerian blog which was born in 2006 and is now one of the biggest and most followed Nigerian media in the country, spanning across socials, websites, and events, and covering the best of Nigeria. We also have Tai Nalon, Executive Director and founder of Aos Fatos, an award-winning Brazilian newsroom using innovative tech and storytelling formats to expose disinformation in Brazil. So we're going to hear from all of them later on. Don't worry, they won't just be on mute. And the agenda for today is Jeremy and I will go through some of the Next Gen News 2 findings. We'll spend about 15 minutes really telling you what we find that's interesting about how younger audiences are consuming the news. And then we'll go into a Q&A, a fireside chat with Dunsin and Tai, where we'll really talk about how they're engaging younger audiences. And of course, we'll have time for questions from the chat. So in true Gen Z fashion, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. Upvote whichever question you think is the best, and we will get to them towards the end of today. So before we dive in, let me just tell you a bit about what Next Gen News 2 is and how we did this research. Next Gen News, the first iteration, started in 2023, and this new iteration follows the same core principle. Our research aims to better understand the future of news consumption in 2030, and we do this by uncovering the emerging news behaviors of younger audiences and their modes of engagement, how they're consuming the news, in the hope that news producers can use these insights to bridge what maybe they're getting in terms of news and what they really want. Next Gen News 2 really focuses on this middle part of our principle. We're really trying to go much deeper into the behaviors that younger audiences have and try to unpack these modes of engagement. How are younger audiences moving between discovering information and going deeper into that information? How did we do all this? Excitingly, this year we have gathered more qualitative and quantitative data. So we've expanded from 3 countries to 5, adding Brazil and the UK to increase our representative in Europe and Latin America. We've surveyed 5,000 respondents across each of these countries. Our respondents are aged 18 and above, and enables us obviously to have some age comparisons, which I think you'll find very interesting in just a second. We've also conducted 2 weekly diary studies with more than 80 young people across these countries aged 28 and below to really understand what are they consuming in a given week, how does that make them feel, what have they learned from it. And lastly, we have interviewed 19 emerging news producers, of which you can see 2 here today. The rest are all on this slide. You can see we've really tried to go beyond the sort of everyday news producers that we engage with and really try to get to the core of emerging news producers that are engaging younger audiences. We interviewed different types of producers, solo creators, digital native publishers, former journalists, even tech platforms to really understand how they're engaging younger audiences. Today, you'll hear from Aos Fatos and Bella Naija about their experience. Let's then get right into the meat, and I'll pass to Jeremy.
Thanks, Lamberto. We were pleasantly surprised by what we saw from these young news consumers. One of the things that we hear all too often is a sense that there is a disconnect between news creators and news consumers, that especially the news from legacy news institutions and news in general is just not interesting to young news consumers. And the results of our work say that far from that, the next generation not only sees the value of news, but that they feel like they have ways to manage the overwhelming amount of news that they see in the world. Now, that attitude is not just specifically about national or local news, but news and information as defined by them in general. But they are, if anything, almost optimistic about their ability to deal with news, which is a little different than what we saw in the first Next Gen News study. When we get into the specifics, one thing that really surprised us were the percentage of 18 to 25-year-olds who say they consume news at least once a day. Some of these news consumers are consuming news once a day, some are consuming news multiple times per day. But in all 5 countries that we studied, it was more than half of all news consumers. While it is true, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, that you see much higher rates of older people consuming news and information, that in general, the young news consumers are pretty active. The other thing that we saw is that about a third of all 18 to 25-year-olds are consuming news multiple times per day, and that 2/3 of them agree that news has specific value for their personal and professional development. When we get into the top sources for news consumption is when we start to see real differences between younger and older news consumers. It may not be surprising, but young news consumers are much more likely to rely on social media, things like Instagram and TikTok, where video platforms like YouTube drastically outnumber TV usage for young people. And you see the sort of natural gap that you might expect between younger and older news consumers. But that even young people use news and information from national newspapers and magazines, about 40% of them. So there's a high percentage. One thing that surprised us was how prevalent the use of search engines were as a means of discovery for news. That especially among younger news consumers, the majority of them say that they use search. You'll hear a little bit later from Umberto about the different ways that the modes that people use for consuming information, but that search plays a big part of that, especially when news consumers want to go a little bit deeper. I think it's also worth noting that it's actually human-to-human interaction that kind of outweighs artificial intelligence. We might have expected to see big gains in younger news consumers already embracing AI, but we still see a much higher percentage of them saying that people they interact with on a daily basis, coworkers, friends, family, actually are a more primary channel of news consumption. And when we ask them what their main news platform is, not just what do they use, but what their main news platform is, this is when we really see how social media is so dominant. It is the number one main news path. More than 65% say that they often or sometimes use that. But surprisingly, we still see national TV and even newspapers and magazines as having a big role. But when you talk about main, it's also worth noting that YouTube, while not as high by percentage as some of these other pathways, is the third most prominent main selection for news. And we do see more and more, I think, a move towards video channels, whether it's YouTube or something that blends video like Instagram or TikTok, being really important as a place that younger news consumers rely on to get news and information. And I think there are 4 key areas that kind of define how young news consumers view different news producers. So one of those is all about credibility. How do they know that someone has the expertise, especially the personal experience that they need? Well, the credibility that they see with individuals really outweighs what they see from institutions. It used to be that being part of a large news brand was sufficient to say you're an expert because you've been hired by that place. Today, young news consumers often actually seem to put credibility on institutions through individuals who work for them. So it's almost an inversion of the way that used to work. The second really important point is around trust, that the way to build affinity is by having trusted information, and the way to have trusted information is by having trusted news providers. So again, we sort of see this reversing of the process where if you identify the news creator and you understand and know them as an individual, then you can believe the information that they provide, and maybe then the affinity to their brand if they're associated with one. Transparency is really important. We heard over and over again from young news consumers that they had formal media literacy training. And what that media literacy training taught them to look for is sort of bias, and transparency is the antidote to that perceived sense of bias. How do you know to trust someone? Well, because they seem very transparent in their motivations. They're very clear and honest about how they make money, about how they do their reporting, about who they include and why. And then finally, accessibility. Historically, news organizations prided themselves on having an institutional voice, on following a clear style guide. And unfortunately, even though that did used to define news, now it actually creates a barrier between young news consumers and news. And we need to use more recognizable language and formats as a way to better connect to these news consumers. And as I said at the beginning, there's a real sense that young news consumers are tuned out, that they're frustrated, and that they actively avoid news. We just did not see that. We really didn't see it. Young news consumers throughout the world really are less likely to avoid news, or at least similarly likely to avoid news as older people. In fact, the only of the 5 countries that we studied where young news consumers were more likely to avoid news was in the United States, and that was by a single percentage point, which is well within the margin of error. So they are about the same as middle-aged people and only slightly ahead in their news avoidance of older people. So this sense that young news consumers are avoiding news is wrong. A big difference is that young news consumers don't necessarily think they need to put in lots of effort to keep up with news. They really believe that news should come to them, that it is the job of news and platforms and news creators to reach the audiences, and they don't, not surprisingly, have some of the habits of older people where they had a specific time of day that they tuned into news or looked for news and information. About half of the young people, a little more, told us that keeping up with the news should not take very much time, but almost 70% of them believe that they should dig deeply into stories that they're interested in. While it is true that young news consumers were likely to seek out a summary, that was as a precursor to going deep. It wasn't instead of. So the young news consumers are not saying we don't want news and information. They're saying when we want news and information, we want to go deep. We really want to understand. We need the context and the background. And Roberto, again, will talk more about how those modes of consumption affect news. And AI is definitely changing how people are engaging with news, but it has not already changed all behaviors. We did see that younger news consumers were more likely than older news consumers to want to see AI playing a role. And when we asked them about how helpful it would be to have specific things like an overview of the story, almost half of young news consumers said that it would be of value, but that only 16% of news consumers thought it was extremely helpful. And you see similar things about how do we make the news easier to understand? Well, about half of young news consumers believe that AI can do that. Providing background on a topic, a little less than half. And then being able to ask questions in the news, having a more interactive conversation with the news is only about 40%, but this will be something that we'll have to continue studying as chatbots and artificial intelligence become a bigger part of how people discover information. And so if I were to summarize where we found ourselves, the young news consumers we studied just see news differently. They recognize that news used to be different for the parents, for the grandparents. There was a specific amount of news in the world. You got the newspaper, you listened to the radio or watched television. It was finite. And a lot of the news consumers talk about the need for it to be finishable. And the big legacy news companies, they got to define what was and was not news. And there was a very specific format to it. But today it's totally different. The news feels infinite. The news consumers talk about how unfinishable it is. The news consumers often feel that they get to decide what is new and what is valuable, and that they want it in forms and styles that feel very much like all the other content in their lives, about content about food or content about sport or content about entertainment. It doesn't matter whether it's from a traditional news producer or a friend or a next gen producer. All of it should be in the same conversational way. And I'm going to turn it back over to Lamberto, who's going to talk a little bit more deeply about how the modes of engagement shape this consumption of news.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeremy. So, as Jeremy says, consumers are overwhelmed with an array of options for where to spend their time. And therefore, they're selectively trying to put that attention where it deserves. And they've developed distinct behaviors and distinctive ways to find content. And that's what we call the modes of engagement. For those of you who are, following our work very closely, you might know that our Next Gen News 1 modes of consumption framework looked a bit like this. It was a way for us to sort of pack all the ways that younger audiences are navigating news consumption. Well, we've kind of updated this as we've learned more about how younger audiences are consuming news. This is the new version called the modes of engagement. And what you can see in particular is that we've unpacked sifting. So sifting is how younger audiences discover the news. And we've decided to break that down into 3 distinctive modes. One is scroll. I incidentally stumble on the news. One is seek. I actually and intentionally want to access that news. And subscribe. I directly receive news from what I signed up for. The reason for us unpacking this is that sifting is the predominant action that younger people are doing. They are overwhelmed by content, so there are a lot of them trying to find and get to information that they're interested in, and they have different modes of doing that. On the right-hand side, our consumption modes haven't changed that much, and the categorization has stayed the same. Younger audiences still showcase 3 distinct behaviors once they want to go deeper into a story. Substantiate is I want to check the facts. Study is I really want to develop my knowledge. And sense make is trying to understand different perspectives. Even though our categorization hasn't changed, we do have vastly more examples and specific behavioral triggers that explain these consumption modes. Lastly, you will notice that we've moved socialize to the bottom. And the reason being is that we found that this is very much a bidirectional mode. In socialize, younger audiences want to both share news with connections so that they improve their social standing, so that they establish expertise, so that they feel that they can talk more deeply with their friends, family, or groups. But it is also a sifting method. Sometimes consumers decide to read a story that they would have found otherwise uninteresting because of the sender of that story. So it is another mechanism of sifting the news. Today, we are not going to run across all these modes. That would take the whole hour, and we want to get to the Q&A. So I just want to really highlight one mode so that you can see what you can find in the report. So let's go a bit into scroll. Scroll is the default method of sifting and the default mode for a lot of younger people because it is low effort. It is about catching up and showing me what's interesting. There are different triggers for this. They might be looking for entertainment. They might be having a quick break between tasks during the day. They might just fear about missing socially important information. And so this might seem, very common to a lot of young people in terms of behaviors. They're scrolling through apps most of the time, and they're looking for things that catch their attention and gets them to go deeper. Reading comments, for example, is another very important aspect and very liked aspect about social media, where they can see how other people are reacting to a story, and then they will make a decision about going deeper. This quote from Estasia in the United States really talks well about this. She says, I can stumble across things and just see things as I scroll. And she almost talks about how she can go into the entertainment side of the app as well as the news side of the app. She knows how to seamlessly go on both sides of apps to get the information she wants. We have a lot of recommendations for each mode, and I won't go through all of them, but this is what you can see for scroll. If your newsroom is trying to better grab the attention of audiences as they're incidentally stumbling upon news, we recommend going into the website, going into a report, and seeing how you might win the first 2 seconds by using a hook that is stronger or by building repeatable, recognizable visual identity. Every single mode has a lot of examples, so really I recommend you digging through it. One example that I do want to show is Local News International, headed by Dave Jorgensen, formerly of the Washington Post. He is a master at scroll. As a lot of our audience members talked about Local News International as an example for them. And what Dave Youngleton does very well is he wins the first 2 seconds. It's always him as the lead character in his sketches when he talks about news. And he always anchors himself and other characters so that people can follow the story and follow the feed, follow it in the feed. He often introduces dummy characters that are literally there just to ask the questions that he thinks the audience wants to know. And of course, he uses the humor and the language within platforms to make news more approachable. So this is our entire framework. Really, I recommend you going on nextgennews.com or into a report to really see examples of how each of these are you can bring them back to your newsroom. Let me just do some quick takeaways and we'll finally hear from Ty and Dunson. I think, as Jeremy rightfully said, younger audiences definitely feel overwhelmed by the news, but they're not disconnected from it. Far from that, actually. They are intentional in how they're consuming news. We heard that they're more likely to be drowning than starving from news. They feel that it's infinite and the challenge is cognitive load. And therefore, they're actively engineering their information environment. They move between modes. They also shape it. They might turn on notifications, give a follow or a like to specific posts to see that more often on their feeds. And lastly, they reward producers who design the story and the experience together. Trust is built, of course, through the journalism, but it is also built through repeatable formats, clear hooks, and thoughtful ways to go deeper into news. I want to finally bring Ty and Dunson to the conversation. I hope this was a good whistle-stop tour of Next Gen News. And I guess I want to start maybe with Dunson and sort of ask you what you found interesting about Next Gen News, what you might maybe felt was new to you in terms of the findings that we have.
Hi, Lamberto. I think discovering that 33% of Nigerians consume news using chatbots was definitely new. Was it surprising? Not so much, but it was new. I found every bit of that research very familiar. Right? It's almost felt like you were speaking to me, the things that we do at Bella Niger and what we should be doing as well. But I could really relate to young people feeling overwhelmed by negative news. I could really relate to that. And when I saw that, I was like, yes, this is why we are here. This is why Bella Niger is here, to bring the positive storytelling and, help people feel less overwhelmed. I think the second part that I found familiar was what I just mentioned. That's 33% of Nigerian news consumers searching for stories and news using chatbots. So I wasn't really surprised, but I found it interesting because just if recently in our newsroom we were talking about search engine optimization versus generative engine optimization, and we were discussing how to ensure that our Bella Niger pops up on chatbots, because we've realized that a lot of our audiences are beginning to consume news using chatbots. So how can we, tailor our content in such a way that when they type something into ChatGPT or Gemini, for instance, Bella Niger pops up?
Yeah.
Right. And we were still trying to figure that out when I saw your reports. And I'm like, yes, we are really in tune. What I found uncomfortable with, I would say exactly what I found familiar to. People are overwhelmed by constant news stories, but as a publisher, I'm pushing my team to churn out more stories. So I'm like, how do I strike that balance? We want to churn out more stories, but then our audiences are saying they are overwhelmed. Like, it's a problem that we need to solve, right? I'm not even going to lie now. I'm also quite worried about 33% of Nigerians consuming news stories from chatbots.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you did this report like maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, it won't be up to 33, right? And now we're having 33. It means that media organizations, particularly in Nigeria, have to constantly innovate, right? We have to constantly think of new ways to how we share stories. And as a publisher, I'm not going to lie, it's a lot of work, and I'm still wondering how we're going to, balance that out.
So many thoughts there, and we'll go shortly deeper into how you try to uncover positive stories in what can be a very negative media environment. Ty, I want to bring it to you. I'm curious what you found interesting, what you found maybe surprising or uncomfortable. What pops out for you?
Well, many things, but I guess that the main thing is, well, I come from Brazil, and we have the highest, it's not readership anymore, but the highest audience for journalism among young people. So probably, and honestly, I don't know why it's so different in Brazil than in other places, because news avoidance in Brazil is also a thing. It's not generational. It's something that's quite uniform among all generations. Uh, People avoid the news. They have news anxiety, but at the same time, they are looking for it. And younger audiences, they are looking for it. We have to still understand how and what they perceive as news, because it can be a news outlet, but it also can be a news creator, it can be an influencer, it can be an entertainer. And what we've come to realize through our own researches internally is that people see our Instagram profile, and they perceive us as an Instagram profile and not as a news organization. So they see our brand as something that is intimately related to social media platforms instead of, for instance, legacy media, which makes sense because Aos Fatos has grown in a social media environment for the past 10 years, and it was over-reliant on platforms such as Twitter in the past, Instagram now, Facebook in the past, TikTok now. So I think that the way that younger people are consuming news is quite fragmented, and their perception of what news actually is, and then we can discuss the patterns and the methodology of news and how the sourcing and all those methods that are standard to us, and they don't perceive as something not valuable, because I think that they see value on that because they want to fact check for themselves, which is something very interesting also from the research. But I think that it's kind of diluted in the way that they perceive news as well. So I think that highlighting it might make a difference, highlighting those methods, those methodologies, and the reasoning behind why authority in a matter, in a subject, not authority in a political sense, why it matters, why methodology matters, because that's how you build knowledge, how you communicate accurate information and build knowledge. So I think that it's something like that. And I felt it was really also really interesting, the point about chatbots as well, because it's something that we've been investing a lot too.
I think super interesting about younger audiences seeing you as an Instagram brand, and you could be different things on different platforms. That's a really interesting point. Dunson, let's go back to your point around finding stories and making younger audiences feel less overwhelmed. I'm kind of curious, as a brand that's really, spotlighting positive, constructive stories in Nigeria, in what might be a negative news environment. How do you uncover those stories? How do you systematically get your newsroom to highlight those stories, find those stories, all the way from identifying them to then publicating them?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we do internally is constant team orientation and reorientation. That's having meetings, reminding the team of who we are and what we do and why we're here, basically. What that helps with is it helps shape our mindsets and our perception towards what's best for us and what we regard as news. Yeah. So when we have a new team member join us, we teach them how to think positively about news. We teach them not to chase the high. Everyone wants to report gossip, right? Everyone wants to be the first to break that bad news. But then we teach them to slow down, right? And then recognize the kind of news that would be great for our own audience. So that's what we do internally. We are always constantly on the lookout for news that celebrate African excellence, right? News stories that are positive, right? Celebratory stories. If you look at the world today, we have wars happening in different parts of the world, right? But as one country is bombing another country right now, there are people who are probably making one grand discovery, right? There are probably scientists who are solving issues of any issues. Was it last week I read of a country that has succeeded in eradicating cervical cancer? So bad things and good things happen concurrently. What we have decided to do is to then cast the spotlight on these good stories, right? So how are people celebrating today? What are they celebrating? Did they buy a new car? Did they build a house? Did they solve a problem in their community? Did they graduate from the university with the perfect grade? Those are the kind of stories that we watch out for. And I'll give practical examples. This year, some university students graduated with the perfect GPA. I didn't graduate from university with the perfect GPA. So it's news. It's news. Imagine graduating with 5.0 and having A's all through. It's a big deal. So those kind of stories, we report them, we celebrate these people, but we also don't stop there. At Bella Niger, we have what we call the levels of news sharing or storytelling. The level one is you see a news story that is really nice, that is celebratory, that inspires, that is educating, or shows African excellence. Then you share it. The second layer is then reaching out to these people at the forefront of excellence and having that conversation with them. So what we did when we saw graduates who had the perfect GPA was, after sharing their news story, we then reached out to them to say, hey, come sit with us, have a conversation, tell us what and what you were able to do to get this, right? That way it inspires other undergraduates. That is a different level of news telling. But of course, we also recognize that, we cannot be oblivious to the things that happen in the world. Bad news happen, and these bad news are also important storytelling. So what we then do is, for bad news, we begin to look for solutions in the midst of problems, right? Or we begin to look for stories of resilience instead. I'll give another example. Just a couple of days ago, I was scrolling through Twitter and I saw this person who is a farmer in another state, and he shared the story of how he was on his farmland when he was kidnapped by bandits. Now, that's a horrific story. And he was in captivity for like a couple of weeks, and a whole lot of negative, bad things happened to him. That's a really bad story. But there's a silver lining there. He escaped, right? He eventually became free. Now, when we sit down to have a conversation with him, we are actually shining the light on what he did to become free. Who were the people who stepped up during his time of need? What happened? So it's a matter of, one, chasing the positive stories, and then secondly, even in the midst of negativity, right, looking for that silver lining there, looking for stories of resilience, and ensuring that the stories that we share are really, really nuanced. They are human, they are filled with empathy as well, right?
I think so many interesting there, bringing the actual element of the story into your reporting, getting them to talk about their story is a really interesting and sort of different point to bring. I want to bring in Ty now, who, Aushvatos is known for its fact checking. Sometimes fact checking can seem a bit unsexy, for a lack of a better word, and top down. How do you make design choices so that it gets to people and is interesting for younger audiences?
Sure. Yes, we lack charisma many times. But I think that it's a problem in journalism itself from ages now, in which this top-to-down kind of approach is out of fashion now. And it's been for a while, but at the same time, we have the experience by being heavily on social media and engaging with our audiences that many young people, but also, not only them, there are more generations out there that they want to call things as they actually are. So it's expected of us to call, of course, something false or misleading, and using proper words, like saying that this president or this prime minister, or this politician is lying, is something that people expect us to do now, like on a daily basis. And even though it's kind of authoritative for some, like we don't have anymore the obvious entitlement to say that and make people believe in us. It helps us if we do that consistently, transparently, and if we cover as many topics as we are able to, because what we've been perceiving as something that people and like young audiences for sure are against is over politicizing things. They are tired, and this anxiety and the news avoidance, that it stems from this anxiety about everything is political. And yes, of course it is, but also you have to find out ways to make a difference in people's lives. Many of our coverage has gone through stating to people why things are false, or why falsehoods matter, because they can engage, for instance, with scams online due to falsehoods that they might see on social platforms, or on WhatsApp or Telegram, or what else they are getting information from. So basically, it's stating why things matter in the practical, real world has become some sort of leverage that we've built, trying to make sense other than just pointing the obvious that someone is telling lies. Why are they there? And what are the good sources for you to fact check them? We also list that. We publish explainers, not explainers about general subjects like every place now does, but explainers about our own fact checks, our own reasoning behind why we decided to fact check something. And also we are also experimenting with AI, in which the chatbots are able to summarize most of our text work and present them with another language that is it's more thoughtful, amicable, and engaging in some sort, because you can have an actual conversation about a specific theme and then delve into that theme and try to understand a broader narrative, which is something that we don't have scale to do that one-to-one. We don't, I think no news organization has the capacity to do that, because we are set in a broadcast model still. So I think that these approaches, which are not the end in itself, they are evolving as we speak. I think that these kinds of approaches, they generate trust, they leverage transparency, and they might help us in the long run to to build different audiences from different generations and thrive in many platforms, because also there are different audiences in different platforms, and we are expected to adapt to each of them.
Super. So many interesting things to draw out there. If no one has seen Aushvato's chatbot, we'll link it in after the webinar. It's really an interesting case study to sort of see how to use AI and in fact checking, which some people might not think directly about that. I want to move now maybe to organizational changes and how you get your team to embrace new ways of doing journalism. Duncan, you mentioned a bit at the start that every new hire gets sort of told how to think positively about a story. If I'm an editor in chief looking at this presentation, what would you tell them about getting started with these new types of storytelling? How would you what advice would you give them in terms of how to organize their teams to do this type of stories?
Documentation. A lot and a lot of documentation. I feel like I have a document for everything. I have a document for editorial guidelines, what positive storytelling is. I have a document for AI. Like, I have a guide for basically everything, down to how to write headlines, how to, frame your headline in a way that it's not rage bait, in a way that it's not negative. So I basically have a document for every single thing, right? And then multiple team trainings. You can never train your team enough, especially when we are surrounded by negative, storytelling, right? For us, it's also that it might sound unconventional, but watching out for people's behaviors. I tell people that Bella Niger is one of the best places to work, because even internally, beyond, just sharing positive news, internally, we try to keep everything positive as well. So when we have new team members who do not want to adapt to our own behavioral changes, it poses as a problem for us. But there's one thing I'll never forget. This was in 2020. I think I had written two stories about two very unique Nigerian innovators and change makers. And those stories made me feel good, right? Mind you, before I joined the team, I was like a social activist, always writing stories about, African problems, Nigerian problems, the government, and all of that. And I thought I was making a change through storytelling. And I had written these two stories about these innovators, and they made me feel good. And I remember my CEO calling me one night to say, hey, she really loved reading these stories. How did I come up with the stories? And then I walked her through my processes. And then she said, you see, how did writing this story make you feel? I told her as well. And she said, look, there are a lot of problems in the world, and everybody knows these problems. So we are not saying anything new if we keep spotlighting or highlighting these problems. We are not making any changes, because we are basically saying what everybody is saying, right? So the best way to make change is to actually say something different. And I held that with me, and it has guided every single thing I have done on the Bella Niger team from 2020, and this is 2026. Yeah, so having those constant meetings with your team members, teaching them what you stand for, who you stand for as well. Externally, I would say one way we have navigated this too is also reminding our own audience of who we are and what we stand for. So there's this fun thing we do, maybe not so fun, is when we spot negative comments on our social media platforms, we delete them immediately, right? Because we always try to ensure that we don't have trolls, in our community. Guess what? What that has done is, today, when someone posts a negative comment, it is other people who caution them, not us. So other people tell them, hey, remember you're on Bella Niger, we don't accept this here. it means that our audiences have gotten used to our own culture, right? And then they have also adapted it. So while we are working internally, we are also working externally, building trust between our organization, that's Bella Niger, our subjects, the people that we interview, and then our audience. Sometimes, even when we share news, because we are humans eventually, when we share news that is not totally in alignment with who we stand for, what we stand for, it is our audience that corrects us and say, hey, Bella Niger, I did not come here for this. So over the years we have ensured that building credibility, improving the mindset and perception of our team members
Yeah.
towards what constitutes news for us, and then constantly engaging our audiences have helped us build the kind of reputation that we have today, right? So if news publishers can, incorporate those three, I'm pretty sure they'll be fine.
Super, super interesting answer. I mean, I love the idea of creating the community around that supports the way you see news to be published. Ty, let's maybe go to some of the audience questions. And I saw one which I thought was quite interesting, which is how do you make sure you still report and guide audiences on the less popular stories and topics, and don't fall in the trap of focusing only on stories that you know will do well? A bit of a tough one there for you, Ty.
Well, this is quite difficult because we, as a fact-checking driven organization, but also a disinformation and misinformation covering beat, we have to be really aware of what to cover for us to not amplify something that might be harmful for the audience, or to help actually to spread an agenda which it can stem from a problematic path. So we are always trying to understand what is viral on social media, for instance. Who are the players, the political players overall, but also other types of players that have leverage on social media platforms, and due to that can be amplifying disinformation, hate speech, digital threats as a whole, or might be twisting and downplaying public policy issues that might be harmful to society as a whole. So it's difficult for us to delve into not unpopular subjects, but something that are not driving people to like things on the internet, to engage with them on the internet. So it's a difficult task for us because overall we are covering what's viral, what
Mhm.
people are being deceived about, and most of times it's not always, because this information, it can be niche as well. And that's a problem also, because we have to find out a way to cover something that is niche or that is really restricted to some groups and not to amplify them. So I think that the approaches that we have are different. For instance, we see something that a piece of disinformation that's not viral, but it's harmful. We go there and fact check that, and with that we feed our database of fact checks. So if someone has to engage with our chatbot, for instance, they will have the proper answer to that. So if they go to our website, try to find something, or go to Google and find something regarding that subject, they will be able to get their answers. But we will not proactively engage with the audience and publish that on social media, for instance, or make a video about that, or a podcast or a newsletter. We won't. So basically, it's not a matter of covering, but giving the proper, promoting that in the best way possible and avoiding promoting if it's the case.
Mm-hmm. I think your point on looking for the viral stories is really interesting. I think, but with both of you and with all our emerging news producers, all of them talked about having to be deep consumers themselves of these platforms in order to properly report on them. And I think what you were getting at there was quite interesting in that you're in those platforms, you're really trying to study what is going viral and how in order to really be able to fact check it. Jeremy, I want to bring you in because there's the classic and almost very difficult for us question to answer, which is how do you effectively monetize an audience that consumes more and more via social media? I can take a quick stab at it first and then pass it on to you. I think what we've seen, especially with our emerging news producers, is they're very innovative ways of creating basically a membership. People are gravitating towards community, as Dunson spoke about, a place where everyone is on the same page about how to talk about the news, whether that's a paid Discord channel or whatever that might be. We're seeing that become quite popular for younger audiences. But also things that are very different. Lemonade Stand, which is a news creator in the US, has launched a book club, and they've seen great success where younger people join that sort of news creator, whatever they're reading that month, and they will join a sort of webinar like this, paid membership to talk about that. So I've seen some interesting examples. But Jeremy, what's your take?
Well, I think a couple of things that more traditional newsrooms need to do is one, that they need to find ways to really empower and center individuals within their newsroom. That we maybe historically didn't think enough about how do we promote an individual reporter or maybe an individual editor or analyst or columnist as the primary brand, and the secondary brand is their newsroom. And when you do something like that, then you can think about a strategy where you sell tickets to live events. You can think about a strategy where people subscribe to a Substack or pay for an ad-free experience, or maybe even treat them like we treat athletes in the United States and allow them to earn their own sponsorship revenue and sort of represent products. But the key in all of this is to be very transparent. We are earning money to support news in these ways. These are the things we will do. These are the things we won't do. And as long as you maintain that transparency, I think you can do a lot of experimentation on the revenue side.
Awesome. Ty, Dunson, do you want to also jump in terms of how do you monetize younger audiences? Is that something you're thinking about, worried about, or seeing interesting examples in the industry? Maybe I'll start with you, Dunson.
Okay, to understand your question, are we talking about monetizing platforms here?
As well, however you think younger audiences, more and more of them consuming on social media will mean that potentially monetizing through platforms is important. But whatever you think is interesting in terms of younger audience monetization.
Okay, from where we stand at Bella Niger, we do not monetize platforms. We also do not monetize our content at all. So it's basically free for everybody, But I've seen a couple of people actually monetize their newsletters, and make money through social media platforms. I have my reservation around monetizing platforms, right? Because I am seeing firsthand what it's doing to a lot of Nigerian creators here, particularly on Twitter, where we are seeing the rise in what we call banger boys and banger girls. Basically mean people who rage bait so that they can make a couple of bucks on Twitter, right? And it's just very, very it's tricky because yes, we want to make money, but the rise in platform monetization is why we are seeing a lot of overwhelming content into this world where there are very little filters, particularly on social platforms, right? What I would say for a lot of young creators, right, is most likely collaboration with brands, most likely collaboration with brands. I've seen it work firsthand here in Nigeria, where a lot of creators then collaborate with brands, to create something and make money off it. But when it comes to monetizing platforms, it's great, but I have my reservations. And then when it also comes to monetizing content, there's this subscription model. I also have my reservations around that, but I'll just say it's because I'm first a journalist before a media entrepreneur. Journalists are usually all about the storytelling and not the money side of things. I'm sure if we had a media entrepreneur here, their position will be different, right? But in terms of monetizing content, monetizing platforms, I really, really do have my reservations around that. Monetizing content, because I believe that news should be free for all. Right, that's my stance. But I would say brand collaboration has worked really well for a lot of creators here in Nigeria. So maybe it's something that other creators can explore as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Dunson. We're almost at time, so I want to get the last question, and I want to get all of your thoughts really quickly. By 2030, next gen audiences will dominate the market. At least that's what we believe here. What's one capability that your newsroom must seize in order to get that opportunity? What's one thing that you think everyone needs, a newsroom really needs to seize on to engage audiences? I'll go with Ty, then we'll go to Dunson, and we'll finish with Jeremy.
Well, actually answered the previous question. One thing that we found useful, not only from younger audiences, but it has an important instance on funding. It's not funding journalists, but funding tools that we provide to people. It's basically what many newspapers used to do 20, 30 years ago, which was monetizing through services. We have an AI-based transcriptor tool, Escriba, which many students from the university, but also school, find useful to transcribe YouTube lives, interviews, audios, many things that they are researching and indexing. So we've developed this tool in-house, and it's something that we found useful for audiences and monetization. But regarding what comes next, I think that being really aware of what your audience wants in each platform that you are working at. We've come to have started having an audience section in Os Fatos, to having a proper branch for audience and data gathering. So it stands for almost 1/3 of our team now, like promoting whatever we do to each kind of audience that we have, not only younger ones, but the actual whole ecosystem of Os Fatos readers and users.
Awesome. Dunson.
One word, innovation, but because innovation is very layered, I would say having a very deep understanding of, platforms, distribution channels, and just like Ty said, having deeper understanding of your audience as well. Like in 2030, you want to create content that one appeals to Gen Zs, right? Which would probably form the largest size of your audience, but you also want to create news that will meet them in their specific platforms, and the news that they can share as well. I think that's where the socialized bit comes in the research, right? And to do this, you first have to have a deep understanding of what these platforms require. You wouldn't create a TikTok content for Twitter, for instance, and you would not create an Instagram content for TikTok, right? And then you won't take a YouTube video and post on Instagram. It just doesn't make sense. So, but when you understand, okay, this is Instagram, this is YouTube, this is TikTok. My audiences on TikTok are a little more playful, so they would like to see probably behind the scenes of how I do what I do. My audiences on Twitter are very serious and they like conversations. So we're going to take social conversations there. My Instagram audience, they just want to be happy. So we're going to take happy conversations there. And then on WhatsApp channels, okay, you know what? Why don't we run polls from time to time, to keep them engaged? So when news producers have deep understanding of platforms, of distribution channels, and of their audiences as well, it's easier for them to innovate. Right. It's very, very, so I would say, move from the story first model to the distribution first model as stated in the research, and you're not going to have any problems.
Perfect. Thank you, Dunson. Jeremy, really last point.
So news organizations, it's really easy to say center on individuals, but the reality is if it were that easy, we would have already done it. So we have to think about a compact. What is it that the news organization gets from centering on individuals? Well, it's pretty clear. They build affinity, they build credibility, they build tighter community connections. All of those things are great. But what is it that the news organization is doing that makes it worth that individual not going off on their own and doing the same thing? News organizations, especially legacy ones, need to change how they approach and describe their relationship with content creators. We used to talk about reporters. Reporters were given assignments. Even if the reporter proposed the assignment, it was from the top to the bottom. Instead, we need to think about how news organizations can support content creators, can help them with marketing, can help them with events, can provide benefits, things like accounting and retirement, all of those kinds of benefits. And we need to think more holistically the way that a talent agency guides stars, whether they're in music or sports or movies, and less about more of a factory. Newsrooms can't be factories, especially when they're so dependent on individuals.
Amazing. Thank you, Jeremy. I mean, 3 great points to end with. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Ty. Thank you, Dunson, for all your time and all your thoughts today. I just want to really quickly wrap up and thank you for listening. The report will be sent to you after the webinar, as well as the presentation today and the longer version. So you'll see more examples in the presentation. So please look out for that. And if you want to reach out to the research team to explore any opportunities, future collaborations, or you have an internal workshops that you're doing with your editorial team, please feel free to reach out. We would love to help. Thank you as always, and enjoy reading Next Gen News.